The Real Stories, a powerful and harrowing historical narrative set in 1885 Arkansas. It outlines a cyclical tragedy. Freed black families, having built fragile but hopeful communities post-Civil War, are systematically betrayed, kidnapped, and forced back into a state of slavery through deception and violence. The air over the Delta in the autumn of 1885 was thick with the scent of ripe earth and hope. Elijah Freeman wiped sweat from his brow, not from the mild sun, but from the sheer joy of the sight before him. His land, 10 acres bought with 5 years of back-breaking labor and careful saving, parceled out from the old Devlin plantation near Pine Bluff. The cabin Head built with his sons stood sturdy, smoke curling from its chimney, where his wife Sarah was cooking a supper of their own greens and ham. "Papa, look!" His youngest, Benjamin, pointed at the schoolhouse being raised at the edge of their community, New Hope. It was a simple frame structure, but to the 50 freed families who called this bend of the Arkansas River home, it was a cathedral. Inside, Sarah and other women taught children their letters from tattered primers. On Saturdays, the sound of spirituals and the rhythms of work songs filled the clearing, a defiant melody against the memory of chains. But the melody had a dissonant counterpoint. Old Man Devlin's grand house still loomed on the bluffs overlooking their fields. Silas Devlin, son of the former plantation master, watched New Hope through a brass spyglass, his jaw tight. The sight of black men owning mules, of black women walking to market with heads high, was a poison in his blood. His fields, worked by sullen sharecroppers, were failing. Debt was a tool, but it was too slow, too uncertain. He craved the old certainty, the absolute control. "They forget their place," Silas muttered to his brother Clyde, and the county sheriff, a large man named Briggs, who owed his badge to Devlin money. "They think the war changed something fundamental. It only confused them." In a back room of the Pine Bluff Mercantile, a plan was forged over whiskey, not a plan of blunt violence that drew the inconvenient attention of the few remaining federal troops and northern newspapers, but one of slick, cruel deception. Clyde knew a man, a smooth talker named Hammond from Memphis, who specialized in labor procurement. A week later, Hammond arrived in New Hope. He was dressed like a successful city man, with a gold watch chain and papers stamped with impressive, if vague, letterheads. He sat up by the new schoolhouse, his voice a beacon of opportunity. "Railroads," he proclaimed. "The iron horse is stitching this nation together, and it needs strong, honest hands, steady wages, good housing for families, a chance to build a real future, to send money home, to buy more than just a few acres." Elijah was skeptical. His land was his soul. But his nephew, Jacob, a strong young man of 20, with a new wife and a baby on the way, leaned forward, his eyes alight. The sharecropping plot he worked yielded barely enough to eat. The dream of steady cash was a siren's song. "It's a trick, Jacob," Elijah warned that night. The community gathered under the stars. "Remember the stories. Freedom ain't a gift, it's a guarded fence. But hope, when mixed with desperation, can cloud the clearest wisdom." Jacob saw his child's future. Others saw escape from crushing debt to the Devlins of the world. Hammond's promises were specific, comforting. He showed contracts. He mentioned Christian charities that sponsored the workers. One crisp morning, 3 wagons rolled into New Hope. Jacob, his wife Lila, and a dozen other men and women from New Hope and other nearby communities, about 30 souls in total, climbed aboard with their meager belongings. There were tearful goodbyes, but also smiles. They were going to work, not to be worked. Sarah hugged Lila tight, a knot of unease in her stomach. Elijah gripped Jacob's shoulder. "You look out. You right. You hear?" As the wagons disappeared in a cloud of red dust, a silent figure watched from the tree line. Silas Devlin lowered his spyglass, a cold smile on his lips. The first catch was in the net. The first day's journey was filled with optimistic chatter. Hammond pointed out scenery, told jokes. But on the second day the roads grew narrower, rutted, winding away from main thoroughfares and into the dense, silent bottomlands of the Arkansas River. The cypress trees stood like skeletal sentinels in tea-colored water. "This ain't the way to no railroad line," Jacob muttered to Lila, who held their sleeping baby close. Hammond's demeanor changed. The smile became a grim line. "Shortcut," he barked, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. When the wagons finally halted in a clearing deep in the swamp, it was not at a railroad camp. It was at a dilapidated dock. Waiting for them were not foremen, but armed men with hard eyes and coiled whips. Among them, on a fine horse, sat Clyde Devlin. Panic erupted. A man named Henry, from a community near Helena, leapt from the wagon. "This is a lie. Take us back." The crack of a whip split the air, followed by a gunshot into the sky. Henry froze. Clyde Devlin spat tobacco. "You're back where you belong. You signed contracts, debt transfer. You work for me now." There were no contracts. There was only force. From under tarps in the boats, men produced shackles. The cold, heavy clink of iron was a sound that shattered souls. Lila screamed as a man grabbed Jacob's arms. Children wailed. The men who resisted were beaten bloody with rifle butts. Bound and terrified, they were forced onto flatboats that moved silently down a labyrinth of sluggish bayous. The world shrank to the murky water, the oppressive trees and the despair in their hearts. The railroad job was a fiction. Their destination was Cypress Bend, a vast, isolated tract of Devlin-owned land unknown to census takers or lawmen, a place where time had reversed. After hours on the water, the Bend appeared. Fields of cotton, half-picked, and a collection of wretched hovels worse than any slave quarter from before the war. An overseer named Jeb, a mountain of a man with a face scarred by violence, greeted them with a leer. "Welcome home," he growled. "The rules are simple. You work from can see to can't see. You try to run, the dogs in the swamp get you. You complain, you get the lash. You are property of the Devlin Planting Company. Forget your names, your numbers now." Jacob was shackled to another man. As he was shoved toward a foul-smelling shack, he looked back at Lila, being dragged in a different direction with the other women and children. Their eyes met a searing moment of love, terror, and utter betrayal. The freedom they had known, brief and beautiful, was gone. The nightmare had swallowed them whole. In new hope, the days ticked by with no letters. Elijah's unease turned to cold dread. He saddled his mule and rode to Pine Bluff, to the address Hammond had given. It was a vacant lot. He asked at the post office, the railroad depot. No one had heard of Hammond or any railroad crew hiring. The sheriff, Briggs, listened to Elijah's concerns with a bored expression. "Your people probably took the work and moved on to better things, Freeman. Or maybe they just got tired of scratching in that dirt of yours." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Elijah rode home in the gathering dark, a terrible understanding crystallizing in his mind. They hadn't moved on. They had been moved, taken. The ghosts of the past weren't just memories, they were a active hunting force. Life at Cypress Bend was a meticulously crafted hell. The dawn horn blasted them from fitful sleep onto the frost-tinged ground. Jeb and his riders paced on horseback, shotguns across their laps. The cotton fields were endless, the bowls sharp as claws. Jacob's hands, once calloused from proud work on his own plot, were now torn and infected. The system was designed to erase humanity. Food was a scant ladle of gruel and a piece of moldy cornbread. The water from the communal barrel was brackish. At night, men and women were separated, breaking familial bonds. Children over 8 were put to work in the fields. Younger ones were left in a squalid pen watched by an elderly, broken-down captive woman. Lila, housed in a women's shack, lived in constant fear for her baby, Mercy. She was forced to work the same rows, the child strapped to her back under the blistering sun. She saw Jacob across the field, his shoulders slumping a little more each day, the light in his eyes dimming. But in the deepest darkness, sparks of spirit remained. An older man they called Preacher, who had been captured years before in a similar scheme, led whispered prayers in the shack. He had a map of the bayous in his mind. "The swamp is a wall to them," he whispered, "but for a soul who knows it, it can be a path. We gotta get word out. We gotta let the world know Cypress Bend breathes." Resistance was subtle and dangerous. A hoe accidentally broke. A section of cotton was picked poorly. One night, Sarah, a woman from Helena with a voice like honey, began humming a song. It was Steal Away, but she changed the lyrics subtly, weaving in the names of landmarks near Pine Bluff. It was a message, a plea cast into the ether, hoping the wind would carry it to free soil. Jacob's resistance was quieter, internal. He stole a tiny sharp flint stone. Each night, in the dark, he would scratch a mark on the beam above his sleeping space, a tally of days in captivity, a testament that he was still Jacob Freeman, not a number. He watched the overseer's routines, the rotation of the guards, the path of the supply boat that came monthly. The breaking point came when a young boy, trying to steal an extra crust of bread for his sick mother, was caught. Jeb made an example. The whip cracked not on the boy's back but on his mother's, forcing her to choose between her child's pain and her own. Her screams echoed across the bend. That night, in the men's shack, a new, hardened resolve settled over Jacob. Escape was no longer a dream. It was a necessity, not just for him, but for them all. Preacher's whispered plans found fertile ground. "We can't all go," Jacob whispered. "One or two. To get to New Hope, to tell Elijah." The plan was insanity with a sliver of hope. The supply boat was due. It was poled by 2 of Devlin's men, and was lightly guarded at the dock for only a short time as barrels of salt pork and meal were unloaded. Preacher knew the waterways. He claimed he could navigate the moonless bayous to a spot near a free black fishing community if he could get a head start. Jacob was chosen to go with him. He was strong, had a reason to fight, Lila and Mercy, and knew the outside world. The night before the boat arrived, Lila, in a moment of desperate daring, managed to slip a small folded square of cloth into Jacob's hand during a rare supervised water break. It was a piece torn from her dress sleeve, with a charcoal sketch of Mercy's tiny hand, his compass. The next evening, as the last light faded, chaos was the ally. Sarah, following the plan, feigned a violent fit in the women's yard, drawing guards. In the commotion, Preacher and Jacob, using a rusted file they had hidden for weeks, sawed through a weak spot in the shack's back wall. They slipped into the tall cane at the field's edge and slithered like snakes toward the dock, their hearts hammered against their ribs. Dogs barked in the distance. They reached the water's edge, the boat tied up, its 2 crewmen drinking and laughing by a fire 20 yards away. The plan was to silently unpole it into the current and let the dark water carry them away. They were almost there when a loose board on the dock creaked. One of the men turned. "Hey!" Preacher didn't hesitate. "Go, son, now!" He shoved Jacob toward the boat and turned, raising his arms to draw the men's attention. Jacob jumped into the boat, fumbling with the pole as shouts erupted. He heard a sickening thud, a grunt from Preacher. He pushed with all his might, the boat lurching into the black water just as a gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past his head. He pulled frantically, muscles burning, following the vague directions Preacher had drilled into him. Left at the Twin Cypress, right when you smell the rotted magnolia, keep the North Star on your left cheek. Behind him, Cypress Bend erupted in noise bells, shouts, baying dogs. They would assume he was alone. They would hunt him. For hours, Jacob navigated the silent, terrifying bayou. Gators groaned. Branches grabbed at him. Every shadow held a pursuer. He pulled until his arms were numb, guided by starlight and the ghost of Preacher's voice. As dawn tinged the sky gray, the swamp began to change. The water smelled different. He saw a trot line, a fishing line. He followed it and saw through the mist the glow of a cook fire on a small, neat homestead. A black man was mending a net on his porch. With the last of his strength, Jacob steered the boat to the bank and collapsed onto the mud, sobbing. The fisherman rushed over. Jacob could only hold up the scrap of cloth with his daughter's handprint and choke out 2 words: New Hope, Elijah Freeman, slavery. The fisherman, Brother Amos, was part of a network. He didn't ask many questions. He fed Jacob, hid him, and sent his swiftest grandson on a mule to New Hope. Elijah was in his field when the boy arrived. The message was breathless, fragmented. Jacob, swamp, Devlin, chains, many people. A fire ignited in Elijah's chest, colder and more determined than anger. He rode not to Sheriff Briggs, but to Pine Bluff's small black church. He found the pastor, Reverend Loomis, a man who had corresponded with Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching crusade. To the editor of the Arkansas Freeman, a struggling black newspaper. To the few sympathetic white lawyers in town, men who had fought for the Union. Jacob, stronger now, was brought secretly to New Hope. In the back room of the church, by lantern light, he told his story. The capture, the boats, Cypress Bend, the whips, the separation of families, Preacher's fate, the marks on the beam. He described the landscape, the number of captives, the armed guards. Reverend Loomis took meticulous notes. The editor, Mr. Porter, wept tears of rage as he listened. "We have the testimony," Porter said, "but the world needs to see it. The white papers will ignore us. We need our own press." The story broke in the Arkansas Freeman under the headline, "Slavery Reborn in Arkansas," a narrative of betrayal and bondage at Cypress Bend. It named Silas and Clyde Devlin. It described the false recruitment. It printed Jacob's account, verbatim, under the pseudonym A Liberated Man, for his safety. Reverend Loomis had copies sent to black newspapers in Memphis, Nashville, St. Louis, and Chicago. The Memphis Free Speech and Chicago Conservator picked it up. The story spread like a prairie fire through the freedmen's communities. Protests were organized. Petitions flooded the governor's office in Little Rock. The political pressure became too great to ignore entirely. Sheriff Briggs, sweating under the scrutiny, was forced to act. He assembled a posse, mostly his own deputies, and tellingly, 2 of Devlin's men, and announced an investigation of Cypress Bend. Elijah and Reverend Loomis knew it was a farce. "They'll telegraph Devlin. They'll hide the evidence," Elijah said. "Then we must be the evidence," Jacob stated, his voice firm. He would go with them. He would show them the way. It was a monumental risk. If the posse turned on him, he'd disappear forever. But he had to try, for Lila, for Mercy, for Preacher. The 2 parties set out for the swamp, Sheriff Briggs' official posse on horseback, and a separate, smaller group following at a distance Elijah, Reverend Loomis, Mr. Porter the editor, and 2 trusted deacons, all armed with hunting rifles and Bibles. They were not just observers, they were witnesses. As predicted, Devlin was warned. When Sheriff Briggs' posse arrived at Cypress Bend, it was a scene of grotesque theater. The shackles were gone. The captives, including Lila, were dressed in slightly cleaner clothes and stood in a sullen line. Jeb, the overseer, was nowhere to be seen. "These here are contract laborers, Sheriff," Clyde Devlin said smoothly, waving a sheaf of fake papers. "Paid a fair wage. A little behind on company store debts is all. Perfectly legal." Briggs made a show of inspecting the shacks, the fields. He interviewed a few captives, his gaze a silent threat. A man, broken by fear, muttered, "Wes working off debt, sah." Lila, holding Mercy, kept her eyes on the ground, her heart pounding. Was Jacob alive? Had he made it? Just as Briggs was preparing to declare the investigation closed, a commotion arose at the edge of the field. Elijah, Reverend Loomis, and their group emerged from the cane, rifles not raised but prominently carried. Porter had his notepad out. "This investigation I sent over, Sheriff," Reverend Loomis boomed, his preacher's voice carrying across the field. "We have a witness." Jacob stepped forward. The effect was electric. A gasp went through the line of captives. Lila's head snapped up, tears springing to her eyes. Clyde Devlin's face turned purple. "That's a runaway, a thief!" Jacob ignored him. He walked directly to the men's shack, the posse and Briggs, stunned, following. He pointed to the beam. "My tally. 1 mark for each day in hell." The crude scratches were there, undeniable. He then walked to a specific spot in the dirt yard and started digging with his hands. He unearthed a small, rotting burlap sack. He upended it. Out clattered several pairs of rusted leg irons. "Contract laborers don't wear these, do they, Sheriff?" Jacob asked, his eyes locking on Briggs. Chaos erupted. Clyde Devlin shouted. Briggs sputtered, his authority crumbling under the weight of physical evidence and the unwavering gaze of the black witnesses with their rifles and notepads. The captives, seeing the shift, found their voices. A woman cried out, "He took my husband to the sugar house, and he never came back." Another man pointed at Clyde. "He shot old Ben for being too slow." The facade shattered. Sheriff Briggs, seeing his complicity about to be exposed to the wider world via Porter's notes, made a sudden, calculated turn. He arrested Clyde Devlin on the spot for disturbing the peace and fraudulent contracts. It was a minor charge, but it was a crack in the wall. The immediate victory was partial. Silas Devlin, insulated in Pine Bluff, escaped arrest. Jeb vanished into the swamp. The state authorities, under continued newspaper fire, were forced to emancipate the captives of Cypress Bend, though no one was ever truly compensated. But the real victory was in the reunion. Jacob and Lila clung to each other, mercy between them. Families staggered out of the bend, free again, their eyes hollow but alive. They returned to a new hope that was forever changed. The community gathered them in, but the songs were quieter now, laced with a grim vigilance. The legacy of 1885 was not freedom secured, but freedom understood. It was a fragile flame in a great darkness, requiring constant guard. Elijah, Jacob, and Reverend Loomis knew the Devlins of the world would adapt. Sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow, these would be the new swamps to trap the unwary. But they also knew something else. They had exposed the ghost. They had forced the world to look, if only for a moment. They had fought not with an army, but with a story, carried by a brave messenger and amplified by a community's will. New Hope became a place of memory and warning, where children were taught the specifics of the betrayal, so they would never be fooled by the smooth talk and the gold watch chains of men like Hammond. The story of Cypress Bend, carried in the pages of black newspapers and whispered in church pews across the South, became a shield. It taught that freedom was not a status, but a daily collective action, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against the resurrected ghosts of slavery is a single unwavering truth spoken aloud. If you were gripped by this story of resilience in the face of betrayal, then you understand why these truths must be told. This narrative is inspired by the countless real acts of resistance and survival that defined the post-Civil War era. The fight to tell these stories continues. Help us keep this vital history alive. Please share this video to spread awareness, and subscribe to Tales of Slavery for more powerful, true-inspired narratives of courage, struggle, and the unbreakable human spirit. Your support ensures these lessons are never forgotten.